Good morning, and thank you all for joining us here for the second annual ACT Nonprofit Excellence Forum. We're thrilled with the turnout. There's about 150 people in this room representing almost 70 organizations that serve the citizens of Alexandria. So absolutely wonderful testament to the dedication of the nonprofits in this area and really an overwhelming response. I'm Lori Morris. I'm a founding board member of ACT, and I'm also the chair of the Community Investment Committee. I have the great pleasure of introducing you to our keynote speaker. You know that the Washington area is blessed with some of the country's, perhaps the world's, most successful entrepreneurs. Likewise, the geography boasts some of the most effective and leading philanthropic lights. My friend Mario is a member of both of those exclusive clubs, probably a few others as well. He's a great entrepreneur and a wonderful philanthropist all in one. Mario, for those of you who don't know, Mario co-founded and built Legion Corporation, a very successful software and services corporation. But when he stepped down from that, he could have taken early retirement from business and rested on his laurels, and very deserved laurels they would have been. He certainly had enough money and enough time to enjoy doing absolutely nothing. But if you know Mario, as I do, you'll know that his energy level and by the way, he's the only person that I know that can return my emails from whatever time zone I send them in within 15 minutes. So you know this man is full of energy. His commitment to the nonprofit sector and also to the children means that early retirement for him really wasn't in the cards. So in 2000, Mario launched Venture Philanthropy Partners. VPP skillfully uses the lessons learned from both the business and the nonprofit world. They strategically invest in the nonprofit sector, building stronger, high-impact, and lasting nonprofit organizations. VPP has invested tens of millions of dollars in 12 Washington metropolitan area nonprofits, including the Child and Family Network Centers here in the city. The model's been hugely successful and very exciting to watch develop. Mario is a great thinker who continues to challenge staid ideas, to seek new information, and to learn from the rich resources of people and agencies in the area. You will hear in Mario's passion today the voice of someone whose commitment runs deep, whose thinking is of the highest level, and whom I personally admire a great deal. I think of there's no one better than Mario to be talking to us today about raising the bar of effectiveness in the nonprofit world. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming my dear friend, Mario Morino.
Thank you, Lori. I always have to ground these introductions, and for those who've heard this before, I apologize, but it's so appropriate. That was a great introduction, but the introduction my daughter gave me at her second grade class when it was Father's Day probably is more appropriate. She said, here's my dad. He carries a briefcase. He's going bald and does a lot of email. That was it. So sort of puts life in perspective real fast. Thank you for the opportunity, and congratulations also to ACT. I think you have a remarkably unique opportunity in terms of the symbolism by which this was started, the entrepreneurial resources that come together to make it in the scalable environment you're going to have to operate in. It really is an interesting convergence of factors that could make this a very special entity here in the region, but even nationally. And that may seem like a lot, but scalability in focus in today's times is really critical to success. I think the subject is remarkably important, and I think it's a subject that is talked about too much and done too little with. And so some of my comments you'll find to be maybe edgy, controversial, difficult to accept at times. Hopefully some of them you'll even agree with a few. But basically, I'm telling you this from our heart, but also from our experience, what we face day to day. I think when you realize what the stakes are, and at the end of the day, it's not about organizational effectiveness, it's about the children and families that you're working with and how they're changing, then you put a whole different bar on what this performance should be about. And I think that's the gist of what this should all be measured by. Before I get into talking about effectiveness and organization structure, I'd like to give you some context and background of where my thinking is coming from. At least you can hopefully rationalize some of the thought process. As Lori indicated, I spent 30 years in the private sector. Probably not as successful as Lori made it sound, but went through, and we did build a company. And I don't say I built it. It was a number of people, and I always had partners and other people there that did it. But basically, it's a good story because myself and my partner started the business in 1973 with $600, no venture capital money. And in 1995, the firm was acquired for just under $2 billion. Now, my stake was a lot lower at that stage, but nonetheless, those are still big numbers, and that's the American dream. Now, why is the statement important? Because I grew up in a low-income neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio. Not in the inner city, but the first concentric ring next to that inner city. And I use my neighborhood as the metaphor for what the 1950s were like for a child in the United States and what they are like in this decade for a child. If I go back to the same neighborhood, and I do, by the way, the kid who grew up in the same home with the same good family doesn't have 1/1000th the chance I had because the community around that family has imploded. And it was the loss of manufacturing jobs in the city of Cleveland that destroyed it, as it has happened across the urban centers in this country today. So my passion comes from that metaphor, knowing what I had as a kid and all the people that encouraged me at every step of the way, and then watching how desperately kids today need ties, not just in their families, but beyond those families, that in fact gives them the encouragement and linkage to go ahead with their life and not think they're stupid, not think they're dumb, and not think they can't get things done. That's what this is about. For 8 years after I retired, I spent time looking at the nonprofit sector. I would be in remarkably different venues. One day I'd be meeting with a college president. The next day I'd be in Hartford on Murder Corner. So you start seeing the community from that level, not the level of sitting in Great Falls or Potomac, but at the street level you see a different life. And if you have the context of where I grew up at, you also understand what this means a little bit, I think differently than one has never experienced it. Basically, what all this did was lead us to creating Venture Philanthropy Partners. And I was co-founded by fellow Alexandrian Governor Mark Warner and business leader Ralph Fernandez and 26 other families in this region that came together to put together basically $32 million. And they were our founding investors that allowed us to get Venture Philanthropy started in 2000. Today, as Lori indicated, we have 12 investments. We call them investments. I'll come back to explain why. They're really large grants in 12 high-quality organizations throughout the region. And by the way, that $28 million has now been leveraged to say, including the $28 million, we can track $70 million that have flowed into this region as a result of the venture philanthropy activity. Meaning other foundations put money in now because we've been at the table, the stability of these organizations as we go forward. So that gives you a little context on my background. But the thrust of my comments are also shaped by the convergence of these experiences in things that we tend to see every day. I can't begin to tell you that I don't think a week goes by that we're not, I don't want to say surprised, but there's not one more thing that we're learning that, in all seriousness, is profound. Because you're on the street and you're seeing the dichotomy, the inconsistency of these many different levels of economic structures in this region, and how they don't communicate, and how they don't intersect well, and what the opportunity is when you are able to do that. What I want to do first is sort of strike at some, not some myths, but some principles that just are things that sort of stick in my mind, just again to help set context about the issue of excellence in organizational building and effectiveness. And it starts with philanthropy. To be very blunt, I think the philanthropic funding system for social services is dysfunctional. It is the core of our problem. Because how we fund is what creates the behavior pattern for how that nonprofit executes. And if we explore that funding process and improve that funding process and change it to be more effective, we can in fact instill a different behavior pattern in the nonprofits themselves, to their benefit, and I think to their glee, I might add, too, as you go through this. Now, one of the things I always challenge is the cry, as always, we need to raise the level of philanthropy. You know, I think this is sort of true. It'd be foolish to say that's not the case. But you know what we really need to do? We have to figure out how to be a hell of a lot more effective with the philanthropy we have today. Executive directors and founders who shield the issue of effectiveness by the comment, we're mission-driven organizations. If you are a mission-driven organization, you should be the one who cares more about effectiveness than anybody else, if you're truly mission-driven. You know, effectiveness is about how well you're serving the individuals, the children and families, organizations you claim to be serving. So your charter should be as effective as possible. Forget nonprofit, for-profit, forget all it takes. It's effectiveness. That's what I'm there to do. That was my mission in life. I chose this as a founder. And really, the real objective is it should be your compelling driving factor to be the best you can do, be the best you can be, the organization the best it can do, and to do it in a way that it introduces a stability that you're going to do it consistently over time. You're not going to disappear in 3 years, which you get back into the funding game. But what happens, we get caught up in what I call the jargon of be business-like, be high performance, and that turns everybody off. And I understand that, by the way. We have stopped using the term business-like. And I'll come back to explain why. It does more damage than any good we could create. But don't use being mission-driven as a shield. It's not an excuse to make the hard decisions a nonprofit has to make to be effective for those they serve. I'm going to keep coming back to remember, it's about the kids and the families. And therefore, if we don't have the right person in place, and that's a friend of our organization, and we're doing them a favor, you know who we're cheating? The kids and families. Because we don't have the guts to make the hard decision to serve the kids and families the best we can do. Boards and funders, we need to be more business-like in our approach. I was dumb enough to say this at one time, too. And I have recanted that position entirely. No, you don't. In many ways, it's the absolute wrong analogy for this field. Running a nonprofit is not like running a business. I'll go on and talk about it. And if you haven't seen the monograph that Jim Collins has written on nonprofit management, please get it. He does an excellent job of explaining the difference between what it takes to run a nonprofit versus what it takes to run a business. Certainly, the words discipline, rigorous, long-term, quality focus are absolutely germane. There's nothing magic that says that's the business world, because WorldCom sure as hell didn't do that, Enron sure as hell didn't do that, and let's face facts. Just because you're a business does not mean you're the best-run organization in the world. Why in the hell do you think there are thousands of consultants making thousands of dollars out there in this field today? Because organizations are so screwed up. All organizations are screwed up. That's the nature of organizations. The bigger you get, the more screwed up you become. And you're constantly churning to make yourself effective. There's nothing wrong with that. That's life. Admit it. Deal with it. I want to give you a story of the danger of being too businesslike. And by the way, the story I'm telling you has still not been thought through and understood. A business person has actually created some fame by crossing the line and working in the nonprofit sector, entered to do work with an after-school program. They looked at the cost of the program per student and felt that what they could do was create a light version of this program and reduce the cost per student, therefore they could touch more kids. He didn't know that what he did, by lowering the cost of the service, they eliminated some of the core factors of what that kid needed for that outcome to be achieved. Now they have a piece of paper running. They're touching a lot of kids, but the outcome is not the same. It's the exact struggle Big Brothers and Big Sisters is running today about having dedicated bigs versus school-based bigs and how that's going to work out in the end. They don't know if that's going to play out yet because will it affect the true outcome that's achieved? Be very careful when one tampers with a model and just look at it from a cost point of view, which is the tendency of a business approach without understanding the makeup of what are the elements that, in fact, achieve the outcome for the child or family that you're serving. So this person has actually created a very strong harm for the organization they're trying to help. What I'm getting at is these simple points. They underscore the misperceptions, the confusion, the almost polarizing reactions people have to the subject of effectiveness and excellence in nonprofits. So what have we learned or maybe observed about the nonprofit sector and effectiveness? And again, from our limited view, I think effectiveness is a result of a combination of relevance to current needs, outcome, impact, achievement, and leadership. The convergence of those factors. It's a function of a workable solution, again, compelling leadership, in remarkably disciplined, rigorous execution. That it doesn't necessarily mean just good business-like, that means good management. And that applies to nonprofits, public agencies, and private enterprise. But before I go too far into the subject of effectiveness, I also want to give you a stratification, because one of the mistakes we made with Venture Philanthropy Partners, we never categorized the types of organizations that we were purporting to target and work with, and we therefore cast an aspersion over too many organizations. And that was wrong on our part. So let me give you sort of a Morinoism, and there's no factual base to this, but we look at the nonprofit sector sort of as a pyramid. At the very top of the pyramid, you have the mega organizations. These are your loyalty-based institutions, your universities, your hospitals, your museums, your large organizations, the Red Cross, American Cancer Society. these are truly nonprofits, but in many respects, they are truly major enterprises, and organizationally, they function much more like a corporation than a nonprofit does. And they have remarkable funding streams and huge machines to raise that money. At the lower end of the pyramid, at the bottom end, is really the heart of the nonprofit world. It's the tens upon thousands of organizations, several thousand just in this region alone, okay, who are somewhere in the size of 2 million, maybe 3 million in size or less, about 10 full-time people or less. Most of them are well under that. They're under 500,000 and 3 or 4 people, actually. And unlike a lot of people, I think this is the heart of delivery in this country. And as people criticize this part of the sector, I think they're remarkably mistaken. The overlap, the inefficiency, all that, that's BS. This is a group of people that typically run on fumes. The typical organization is running on vapor. To assume they're going to be more cost efficient is a joke. They're not spending any money to begin with, for crying out loud. And what they represent is almost the sheer national service volunteerism base of our country. So you don't tamper with that, and what we're describing in many cases doesn't even apply to those kind of organizations. But as they begin to grow, and they begin the 1 million, 2 million, in our target range is to $3 million to $70 million organization, their life changes. And now what happens is all of a sudden is they're just not an organization led by a founder, they're an organization that is providing key social services to a region or to an area, and their fundamental responsibility is different. And now organizational issues totally transcend the role of the founder. And they are a different organization and have a different set of needs. In the largest context, the issues of talent and capital are their most striking demands. And the more those organizations grow or take on size, getting the right talent managerially is probably the single greatest constraint we all face, more so than capital. More so than capital. Because when the right people are in place, somehow they will probably find the right capital. And it's an equation you can dicker with and argue about, but there's a lot of truth to it. Now, we feel that it's that sweet spot is where an infusion of capital and significant assistance to the management teams can have a significant yield in terms of benefit to children and families into strengthening the core of nonprofit delivery in a region. And so that's the focus of our work. And the comments I'm making therefore apply to that area, but also to large part, the organizations that are 1 or 2 million in size who are on the verge of getting into that space. So most organizations strive to be more effective. Everybody tries to do this. But in all candor, they're not willing or ready to embrace the changes inherently involved. We're all like this. I'm like it, you're like this. Change is great until it's on your doorstep. For 30 years, I dealt with change in corporations. And everybody wanted to change until it got to their doorstep. And maybe it ain't so good anymore. The hardest thing in the world, I'm going through right myself, I'll share it personally right now, a major change in my life. And if you don't look at yourself with introspection and ask, where do I have to improve or change? Then as an executive, you're not doing your job. We all have weaknesses. We're human. And we better know how to fix those weaknesses if we're going to be good leaders. Or at least know where they're at so I can complement my weaknesses with good people around me that fill those voids in my organization. Oftentimes when people talk about organization building, capacity planning, effectiveness, they start at the wrong point. This always starts at the top. Always starts at the top. The reason this gets hard is the issues that come up when you do that are so difficult and sensitive to take on. They're always people issues. That's what an organization is. It's not systems. Forget it. It's people. It's always people. Good people will fix the rest of the problems. Wrong people, you're going to live a life of hell. That simple. When it's taken on incorrectly, it's like, the phrase I like to use is rearranging the deck chairs on a Titanic. I sold a lot of technology in my life, and you go in, you put communication systems in place, email networks, and you go into a company, and you'd see they weren't communicating at all well with their employee base. And the guy's telling me, well, when I put email in, this goes back a few years, by the way, when I put email in, we're really going to fix this problem. I'm trying to say, you don't understand. If you don't communicate well now, you're going to communicate worse with email. And I'll give you the analogy I use, and I use it in technology, but it applies to almost every business practice or standard practice that's out there today. When a best practice is applied, and I'm not a fan of best practice, by the way. In fact, I hate the premise. It's about best people. You can almost bet when we sold our software that the bell curve of 2 standard deviations is they would get incremental value from the product. The 3rd standard deviation to the left, the virtuosos, the tipping point people, they would take your product and do things with it that were so miraculous you couldn't believe what they were going to get out of it. And then the other reverse 3rd standard deviation were the klutzes. And what you did is you gave them a product to make bad decisions faster. Keep that in mind. It's all about people. Capacity building, and I don't mean to take on the term here, we've moved away from the phrase. Capacity building as a term of art has now become synonymous with technical assistance, which to me is a morass of services that do not go after the core problems of an organization. Hard comment in this field today. I apologize to everybody who's a technical assistance provider. I'm sorry. You have to start at the top. That's boards and executives. Everything else is window dressing after that. It has to be fixed. If we're talking about building stronger, high-performing, sustainable, nonprofit institutions, institution has a ring to it. It's a lasting entity that's going to deliver value to an organization. So when we're talking about effectiveness again, and being the best we can be, the first and hardest question you want to ask is what we do still relevant? How about that question? Is what we do still relevant? How many nonprofits exist today and the very thing they were set up to do is no longer relevant, but they're still doing a service? You know this really happens in areas that are gentrified. You see a whole population has been moved and you got a group still sitting there serving 1/5 of who they were serving before. And you got to really question why. Or the need may have been solved, literally, and the organization still exists. Relevance is really important. And as a board, you should be asking that question at least annually. Are we still relevant? In relevance takes the second point. Is what we do actually having an impact? Or are we just going to a lot of activity? And this is the debate in the field today. For example, in youth development, one of the leaders in this field is Jeff Canada and Michael Balin. And Michael hit me one day with a point. He says, you got to understand something. He says, unlike all the other disciplines, we don't know what works yet. And he stunned me. He says, no. He says, there's only one longitudinal study done, period, in the field. And that was on mentoring. He says, this is unlike medical research. This is unlike education. There's no research, empirical data that tells us what works in youth development today. Interesting point. So when we're looking at these programs, what works, what doesn't work, right? Second piece is, if it is relevant, are we achieving what we claim to achieve? This is the whole, folks. This is the whole. We start believing our propaganda. But if I'm there to help this child get to this outcome, can I really show that that child and family is benefiting? Can I see that improvement in their life? This is what we're challenging our public schools for across this country today. You're seeing the debate in charter schools. I think it's a major question. When Page cut after-school program funding some years back, he was right as an analysis that most after-school programs were horrible. He's right, they are. But he was wrong to cut the money because what he should have realized, there were some that were really good, and we should have figured out how to use what we learned, because after-school programming is really critical for kids. But the question is it working? Is what you do relevant, and is it effective? Are you doing what you claim to do? So these are, again, I keep coming back to tough questions. And third, I'll give you a harder one. It's the nature of where we're going today. Is there money available for what you do? For Lund, who's an established organization, you're there and you have to deal with this. But today, if you look at the venture world today, commercially, the way a venture person makes the most money is not the decision of which company to make in, it's which sector to invest in. If you pick the right sector, chances are you're going to make money. Regardless almost what company you bet on, by the way, many times. Same thing here. I mean, today, money's flowing to health, money's flowing to alternative charter schools, public education. If you happen to be in a window where the public funding doesn't exist and you're thinking you're going to grow, you got a major task ahead. Because you got to figure out, because public funding is the core of social services. And one of the most educational things we do over and over again is educate our investors, candidly, that public funding is really important. And philanthropy cannot fill that gap. Philanthropy can fill the gap for the $1 and $2 million organizations, maybe a $3 million organization. You get to $7, $10, $15 million, public money is going to be a key part of that equation someplace in there. There are exceptions to that. But today, depending on how you look at it, as low as 86% to as high as 96% is public funding of social services in the United States and probably more so globally. Let's not kid ourselves. We have to recognize the flow of public money is critical to the effectiveness of the equation. So how does one improve themselves? Again, tough question. I think it starts with behavioral change. The most effective thing that happens in our world, and it happened in about half of our partnerships today, is when a new thinking takes place in the leadership. It's like they're liberated. And I'm not kidding you. There'll be people who will describe this to you. They can think differently. Because the poor executive director is under siege, in my mind. They're under siege because they're worried about the next 24 hours, the next crisis in the neighborhood, where the next dollar is going to come from. And to step back and actually think what they want to do 3 and 5 years from now is an unheard of luxury in this field. And why is this so relevant? Because when you don't think in terms of what's possible, you'll never get there. You'll stay exactly in the rut you're in. You'll stay exactly where you're at because you can't see the bigger path. So being able to think bigger, even though you may not be able to do it today, is fine. Because also donors love big visions too, I might add. They love to see you shooting for something large, as long as it's feasible to get there. I want to share with you the story. For those who know, probably one of the greatest experiments going on in our country today, and I shouldn't call it an experiment, is the Harlem Children's Zone by Jeff Canada. And it was funded by Ed McConnell Clark. And if you know, Jeff is one of the most amazing leaders in this country. But Jeff will tell you the story of this funding, this bizarre funding relationship. He said, you know, the first day they came to me, and by the way, they knew each other. Ed McConnell Clark had funded Jeff Canada before when there was Beacon schools and Reedland schools, et cetera. And he said, you know, they said, we want you to give us your vision of the future. And Jeff goes, and we were doing this in the board meeting, by the way, at Ed McConnell Clark. Jeff goes, oh, yeah, here's another funder pulling my chain. He says, they want a vision. Okay, I'll give them a $100,000 vision. So he writes something up, sends it in. And they came back and said, no, Jeff, we really want you to think about what you want to do. So he was still puzzled. He says, here's another, you know, and this is people he knows now. Remember this. They're still pulling my chain. They want a bigger vision. I'll give them $1 million vision. And what he was doing was giving them paperwork that a funder wanted to see. That's the game, right? Let's be honest. What's the paperwork I got to give to appease that funder, to get the money? Forget what's going to happen. How do I get the money? So finally, Mike Balin came out with Nancy Rube. They sat down. Jeff, you're not understanding us. We're really saying that if you could lay out what you want to do, we're ready to fund you. And we're talking about tens of millions of dollars. Jeff paused and said, you're serious? I said, yeah, we're serious. Jeff Canada stepped back and thought through what Harlem Children's Zone would become. For the first time, he had the ability and the time, not the ability, he had the time and the support to say, long term, we could have this kind of impact for children. And Ed McConnell Clark then stepped to the plate. And I always remember seeing Jeff Canada at a Robin Hood Foundation meeting with Marion Wright Edelman, and Jeff come up and says, you're not going to believe this. We did a business plan. And you know what? It actually meant something. He says, I would never have believed this would have been worth anything. Again, think big. Think in realistic terms, but think differently. Think about what's possible. Effectiveness comes from greater rigor and discipline. What does that mean? Quit making whimsical decisions. That's what it means. Quit making decisions because that's what the executive director wants to do. Ken Slaughter is going to talk in a board meeting. He can talk to you about the first time Heads Up got their business, the research back from McKinsey and being surprised about attrition rates in the field. Facts will do amazing things to tell you about what you're doing. Get information. Get real information. Inform yourself. And make sure decisions are information-based, and as Jim Collins indicates, make sure you execute and plan with rigor. Outcomes orientation. I think it's absolutely critical, ultimately, and I think this is the ultimate challenge of the field, by the way, that we begin to understand that we need to manage organizations to outcomes. Now, what does this mean? If you're in the business world, it's easy because, not easy, but your outcome is really a financial target on the short term and a series of other factors that will ensure that financial return long term. And that could be an EPS number, earnings per share number, or sales number short term, but a market share number or an investment R&D number long term, and I can measure, and those are really things I can shoot to. But they're external numbers. They're about my client base. What we have to need to do a lot more in how we manage an organization is know that when we take this act and invest this money here, what's the impact on the outcome for these fifth graders in that after-school program? And think in terms of outcomes. And the big challenge is to actually think in terms of outcomes. Most organizations, candidly, we've never been incented to do that. We've never been trained to do that. We don't think that way. I think the transformation for a nonprofit organization and a sector is actually to manage to the ultimate outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And all decisions then are put in the context of how will it affect the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And that's an attitude first before it can become a system. By the way, if the attitude doesn't exist, I can guarantee you something like with every other system I ever put in my life, you will have a piece of paper that'll be produced that will do one purpose. It will appease a funder. It'll have no value to you internally whatsoever. The biggest flaw with evaluation today. The single biggest flaw with evaluation today. It has very little to do with the benefit of the nonprofit. It's there to appease funders. Just being blunt. What happens after that? If you want to have a great organization, Jim Collins, good to great, you get the right people on the bus. If you're fortunate, you have the right people on the bus. An organization is as good as its leadership. Period. One time I brought some of the VPP team up to Greenwich to talk to the investment team at General Atlantic. We were talking to Bill Graves, and we were with him. I said, Bill, what's the secret to a good investment? He said, make sure they have the right first person and make sure they have the right second person. It's all leadership. The hardest thing for you as an executive director is the kind of decision I went through. If you're not the right leader. I wasn't at one point in my corporation. And the first thing I did is I gave an undated resignation letter to the head of my board saying you can shoot me whenever you got to shoot me. The second thing, I stepped out of my role because I knew that we needed a different kind of CEO to run that business. If you're true to mission, you'd do that. If you're really true to mission, you'll make those kind of hard calls. And it is about leadership, and your management team is the most important thing you're going to do. Your management team and your board are what's going to make or break the organization long term. Everything else flows off that. Everything is window dressing until those two problems are fixed. And again, if this sounds harsh, I don't mean it to be harsh. It is the reality of what it takes to build great organizations. Today, the most difficult transition an emerging organization goes through is bringing in a first chief operating officer, bringing in a first chief financial officer, people in the real sense of those terms, because they change the culture. Don't kid yourself. They're going to change the culture. What you want to do is bring them in a way that you still retain the entrepreneurial resilience and spirit of that organization when it started, but you get a different rigor and discipline in how you execute going forward. Make sure your board has the skills you need. All of this is not about where you came from, it's about where you're going. One of the biggest problems we have when we map what we need in our executives and board is we look at it retrospectively as opposed to where we got to be at. I could have had the greatest management team and board in the world that got me to this point. They may not be the team I need to get me to this point. Those are the things boards are responsible to question and challenge. That's called stewardship. And stewardship leads to governance. And what you see taking place is the role of a board. I think in a board, every board should have what I call, and I'm using a business term here, so excuse myself, and I now qualify this, 2 or 3 gray hairs. You know what that means? 2 or 3 people on the board with the experience base that the executive director will trust as confidants and advisors to help he or she through difficult situations. That's a critical ingredient to every board. There should be a very symbiotic relationship between the executive director and the chairman. In fact, I just learned something in the head of school area. There's actually a program put on by one of the universities that chairmen and executive directors go away, heads of schools, for like a week and spend a week together to learn how to work together as chairman and executive director. Critical things to do. An executive director, learn how to use a board. Most people think a board is a negative, a drag. I think a board is one of the most powerful things you have at your disposal as a CEO, as a leader. Now, because I'm running too long, so I'm going to just summarize quickly. Again, I'm going to come back and be very hard. It's about the right leadership in place in the senior management team. In the board, it starts at those two. If you haven't solved those problems, everything else is window dressing. I'll tell a funny story, maybe not funny to you, but we were trying to get a planning firm in to work with one of our organizations. And they made the mistake of sending me a strategic plan they had done. And, you know, as Lyles knows, I can be sort of blunt at times. And We're having dinner at the Capitol Grill in Tyson's Corners, and right off the bat, I said, you know, it's not even 10 minutes in, we said our pleasantries, hello, how are you? I says, you know, you sent me a plan. I says, you know what? It was really a piece of garbage. I says, it's so obvious that you should have fired the CEO, and what your plan is putting Band-Aids all over this organization. The guy looked at me and says, how did you know that? I said, all you have to do is read your plan. I said, it's obvious as hell you got a problem in leadership. He said, yeah, but we couldn't say that. Well, then don't go to the game, guys. Right? Call for what it is. And be honest about it. That's all. Be honest about it. So what do? You know, in summary, in all these areas, key things to think about in terms of organization building. Number one, strengthen leadership and senior management. And again, hopefully that comes from within, and it may come from without. It may be a combination. Doesn't mean who's in place is wrong, but do they have the skills and background to do where you got to go? Engage, align, and inform the board. They are a critical resource, and ultimately, they become the owners of this organization. It switches from the founder-based to the board-based ownership of an organization. Clarify mission and goals. Nothing is more important than correct expectations. Take a financing view to how one is going to fund this organization, not in the year, but over a 3 to 5 year, 7-year period of time. Invest in cultivating public and philanthropic money, and specifically major donors, which is a very difficult thing for most nonprofits. That means professional staff, people capable in investing in the process. That does not mean promoting, and no offense here, the admin or secretary person who's handling the invites to the event into a fundraising role. You might as well go shoot yourself. Because you have set this person up to fail. That's what you've done. You set them up to fail. It's the worst thing you can do as an executive. This sound familiar, maybe? Understand your theory of change. What is it you're doing that, in fact, is going to affect that change, and can you explain it? That says, when we take these actions, this outcome will, in fact, be achieved. Become outcome-focused in your work. Don't be afraid to market and tell your story, but not just in vignettes. Tell it with concrete numbers, and then the vignettes that add the power to those numbers you've laid out. We see a vision in this region of a core of high-performing nonprofit institutions that operate with a compelling level of leadership in an environment fully supportive of giving all children in the National Capital Region the opportunity to grow into adults, leading healthy, productive lives, and to carry on the American dream for themselves, their families, and their children. That vision goes well beyond VPP, and it should apply, and I hope it applies to everybody in this room. I hope we can join together to see that vision become a reality sometime in the 21st century. Thank you.